I will just give it a couple more seconds. I think almost everyone has joined who is going to join. All right, why don't I kick off? Welcome, everybody. My name is Alistair Foxson, and I'm going to be talking about API security and creating a solid foundation for your APIs. And I'm going to start, let's have a look here. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about OAuth and why it's important to your business and what role it plays in API security beyond the obvious. I'm also going to then talk about other concepts that we've introduced, namely licensing, quota management, and protection. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of policy and why policy is so important in and around API security. And then I'm going to talk about security mediation and how to deal with different security policies within an environment, and how do you mediate between API security and traditional security mechanisms you might have within your organization. Let me just give a couple more seconds for people to finish beeping. All right. So let me start talking about OAuth. So OAuth is very, very important, not just from a technology perspective, but also from a business perspective. Essentially, the success of anyone's API program is dependent on two things, namely the speed of app development itself and the speed of app adoption. So it really has nothing to do directly with API development at all. It has all to do with how people actually can write, how quickly people can write the applications, and how quickly those applications are then used by the end user. Because don't forget, there's sort of three different parties in a traditional kind of equation. You have the API and the API developer. You then have the app developer. And then at the end of the day, you have the user of the application. So the two key things here when I talk about OAuth is the actual app developer themselves and the end user. Irrespective of whether you're using APIs or apps internally or in a B2B context or even to support public mobile apps, it doesn't really matter. Your objectives are the same. You're trying to get people to build apps easily and quickly. You're trying to get them to build them quicker and evolve them with higher degrees of iteration. And you're trying to get people to collaborate around app development. And then when it comes to app adoption, you're trying to create sufficient trust that the end user will actually start using that application, and they will feel safe and secure using that application and potentially sharing their private data. So while it doesn't directly affect your API itself and how the API is implemented, the success of that API is affected by how quickly you build apps against those APIs and how quickly those apps are then adopted. The more apps, the quicker the apps are adopted and the more apps there are, the more your API will actually be used. And that, I assume, is the objective of building an API in the first place. So let's look at how do you actually speed up the app development itself. The big problem with developing applications is how do you actually, as an organization, as a Fortune 1000 organization, how do you decouple those stodgy, complex business processes that you have internally from the app development process? It's a huge temptation for organizations to think, okay, how am I going to certify new apps that are being built? How am I going to control how apps get built? And that is a laborious process which most app developers aren't keen on participating in. So it's really, really important, I feel, that you decouple the business processes that you have from any of the application development processes. You may have seen messages similar to this before around OAuth and around people who have embraced OAuth. And this is quite a common and key theme throughout the sort of OAuth discipline. The basic idea here is that you don't bog down the app development with traditional security models. If you can think about the legal agreements, the storage of user credentials, the exchange of private data, these things are massively complex for a Fortune 1000 company to grapple with. The legalese around it, the risk, the exposure, incredibly daunting. So if you had to put, if you depended on your application developers to reliably and safely store user credentials, for example, that's something that would probably terrify you as a Fortune 1000 company and would expose you to all kinds of legal problems and constraints. So what you want to try and do is you want to decouple those business processes from the actual app development processes. Then you also want to speed up app adoption. So firstly, you want to speed up how apps get built, and then you want to speed up app adoption. Everything's about speed. You want to get to your goals as quickly as possible. But businesses contain sensitive information and typically enable sensitive transactions. If you wanted to do anything useful, then you're going to be dealing with sensitive information, user credentials, and things like that. So for high-speed app adoption, you really need to enable trust. Customers need to trust your applications. So what that boils down to is that sensitive information and those sensitive transactions have to be controlled and managed by the customer, and the customer needs to feel that that trust is respected and that trust is earned. So generally, you need a way to remove that friction. Everything about trust and everything about the bogging people down in business processes amounts to friction. And you need to reduce or remove that friction that security and privacy and confidentiality introduces into the equation. You want people to be free to build and adopt apps. So you need to allow the apps to participate in a secure relationship. People need to be able to opt into the sharing of private data and confidential information just in time. In other words, you need to be able to build an app without having to worry about it. And only when the end user is actually committed and starting to use your app, only then do they opt into sharing their confidential and private information. So it doesn't slow down, A, the adoption of the app, or B, the actual app development. You need to be able to allow people to build apps where they don't have to store credentials. They need to be able to build apps that access data with only a limited set of required permissions that the end user has adopted into. And the end user needs to feel assured that they can opt out of any kind of sharing of confidential information or the implementation or the actions of secure transactions. So all of these things basically equate to and are provided by OAuth. And I'll leave you to search where in the OAuth specifications each of these different things comes from, but it's really, really important to understand philosophically why you need something like OAuth to actually enable and ensure that your API is secure. So I'm going to discuss a number of different things throughout this presentation, and that's just the starting point. How do you actually authenticate and grant users authorization so that they can use your apps and in turn use the APIs that are supporting those apps? And in general, why OAuth is very, very important as a fundamental building block for your API and your API platform. So let me talk next about licensing. And licensing is a concept that we've introduced that basically describes your business model. So many people ask me, how do I actually create a business model, build a business model around APIs? How do I monetize APIs? How can I create a gold, silver, and bronze license where the bronze is free, but they only get so much access? The silver is a bit more expensive, and they get a bit more access, and the gold is really expensive, and they get everything, and they can eat as much as they want. How do you actually enable a business model? How do you actually monetize your APIs and bring them to market? And that is wrapped up in a concept that we call licensing. So you might want to enable your business model based on different operations or resources or levels of service. In other words, you might have one big API, and you might want to slice and dice it up based on different partners or based on different licensing models or based on different lines of business. You might also want to slice and dice it based on different levels of service. So the free one is super slow and the expensive one is really fast. Or the free one you can only call 10 times a month, and the most expensive one you can call 100 times a second. All of these things get enabled by what we term licensing. And during the app provisioning process, when you actually are in the system and you're connecting an app to an API, you want to actually present those licenses that are available to that developer. So the app developer can say, I would like the free one or the expensive one. And those licenses that that developer chooses needs to control the runtime entitlements to the APIs, the visibility even to the documentation, and quota policies, which I'll get onto next. So if you look at the little screenshot on the bottom right here, you can actually see how I've created 5 different licenses: basic, the NDA basic, the B2B basic, the small to medium enterprise, and the big enterprise licenses. And each one has different scopes and different profiles associated with it. So scopes are basically things like users, organizations, files, fields, machines, read-only, update-only, something abstract that defines a permission that you can then map to your different API operations within the system. Your profiles essentially amount to different quality of service policies, which I'll get onto next. But it's the number of requests a second, the number of concurrent connections, the amount of bandwidth that you're allowed to consume. So each license wraps up a set of permissions and a set of quality of service policies or profiles that are associated with that license and are then enforced by the platform once the user has chosen which license they want to use. So licensing is a really, really important part about actually describing and ultimately enforcing whatever business model or monetization policy or practice you want to put around your API. At the end of the day, you want to see how many people are using which licenses, and you take that information and then you bill them, basically based on which license they've chosen and how much they've used. You can even tier the licenses or change the quality policies to create overage kind of plans similar to cell phones. So it really all boils down to how you want to monetize APIs, whether you want to monetize them directly or whether you simply want to use licensing to control access to various parts of an API for different partners and business channels. So licenses is vitally important in abstracting runtime entitlements and permissions and visibility of documentation and the API itself. So let me just describe briefly a flow that would happen typically at runtime. So the first thing that happens is a message comes in from a mobile application, and the platform needs to then authenticate that application. And it might be because or it might be authenticating based on the application ID or the SSL cert. A number of different ways of describing authentication policies exist, and they could be OAuth, it could be HMAC, it could be HTTP headers, it could be SSL context. But at the end of the day, you are authenticating the application that is making the API call. Once that authentication has taken place, you then figure out which license it requires, or which license governs that particular transaction. Is it the gold, the silver, or the bronze? Once you've figured out which license it is, you then figure out which quota policies to associate with it, which SLA policies, what bandwidth, what throughput restrictions, what concurrency restrictions need to be applied to that inbound message before passing it on to whatever backend system might exist. So this kind of describes the first step might be OAuth, which I described first in my presentation, and secondarily, the second step being the licensing and the determining of that licensing. And then the third step is figuring out what quota policies need to be applied once you know what license is appropriate to this particular transaction. So that brings me to quota management. Quota and quota management is all about how do you enable your business model. One way to think about licenses, it's a way to describe and communicate your business model. People can see on the screen, I've got gold, silver, and bronze, and there's a description there that says that's $10, that's $5, and that's free. That's a way of kind of describing your business model and communicating it to the customer. Quotas is all about how do I enable the business model at the end of the day. How do I enable different licenses with different levels of service. And I spoke previously about the levels of service being things like throughput, the bandwidth consumed over time, concurrency, and availability. You might have policies, for example, that say the gold level license allows you to have 1 megabit per second of traffic, or it might have 10 gigabytes a month, or you might have 10 concurrent connections, or potentially 1,000 transactions per second. All of these things are examples of the kinds of quotas and quality of service and SLA policies that you can put into a license, which is then enforced by the platform at runtime. You can also measure and report on availability. So this is kind of the opposite effect, right? Throughput and bandwidth and concurrency, these are constraints that you put onto the application. Availability is kind of turning around and saying, I will promise you this level of availability. I will give you 3 nines or 4 nines or 5 nines, or I will give you a minimum of or a maximum of 4 milliseconds of latency. These things can also be expressed in licenses as guarantees to a particular licensing plan. And all of these get reported on and communicated to both parties within the transaction, both the API administrator, you as an organization that is publishing an API, as well as the developer that's gone and built this application. Once again, it's vital to remember that these applications and these APIs might be used internally, they might be used between partners, and they might be used publicly. So you might be launching sort of an open API practice, and most of those consumers are going to be signing up for free, and you don't want them to overwhelm your system before they finally hand over their credit card number. So you want to create these different tiers of service. For B2B, you're probably going to be focusing on the availability more so potentially than throughput constraints. You don't want to necessarily constrain your partner, but your partner probably does want you to promise a certain level of availability, a certain level of service. Internally, these things are actually quite useful as well to prevent applications from going wild. It's very, very easy to build a bad application when the API responds well and efficiently. People tend to not think about how to potentially cache or optimize their application for the best consumption of an API. So putting these constraints around throughput and whatnot in place are good ideas, even internally. Now, what happens when one of these quotas is exceeded depends a little bit on you. Either you can cut off or just generate events when the quotas are exceeded, and those events can then be used for overage billing as well. So you might decide you're going to cut off somebody after they have reached a maximum limit of 100 transactions per second, or you might want to be like a cell phone company and start charging them overage. And that all really depends on your business model. It all comes back to how do you actually want to make money, and how do you as a business want to go out and publish an API and bring it to market? What is the business model that surrounds that particular API? The next component of the solid foundation. So I've spoken about authentication and authorization. I've spoken about licensing and enabling a business model. I've spoken about licensing in terms of quality of service and managing quality of service. Now let's talk a little bit about protection. Protection is sort of guarding that front door. How do you prevent denial of service, injection attacks, cross-site scripting, viruses from coming into your organization? How do you actually protect your back-end systems and protect your overall business and reputation from anything malicious or potentially even accidental? As I said before, people can write some terrible applications, and those applications could actually create a denial of service kind of event. So it's really, really important that you protect your business and provide these denial of service, injection attack, cross-site scripting, antivirus policies within your infrastructure to protect that API. This is both for the sake of your backend systems as well as the reputation of your API, both in your B2B, in a B2B context as well as in a public context. So authentication, authorization, licensing, quality of service, and protection are vital policies that need to be applied in your environment and to your APIs. So let's talk a little bit about policy. I've mentioned it on and off through this presentation, and a lot of people are really confused about what policy is, and a lot of vendors will tell you something is policy and it's not. So let me just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about policy and why it's important and what it is and what it isn't. So if you go to an encyclopedia or whatever, policy will basically say it's a definition of an organization's objectives and guidelines for how to achieve those objectives. But what does this actually mean? At the end of the day, a policy is something that is an expression of best practice. You want people to obey a particular kind of policy. You want people to stay within the confines of an authentication policy, a protection policy, SLA policy, quality of service, etc. The interesting thing about policies is how they are actually applied in an environment. So many people will, and other vendors will come and draw up a fancy user interface and say, okay, I can go in here and I can drop in a security policy here and define it. And I can go in over here and I can apply a quality of service policy. Here's a nice window. It pops up. I fill in all the different values, and it becomes part of the definition of the API. We have a slightly different outlook, and I believe that it's the right outlook. Essentially, policies might need to or probably should be defined by different roles. So policies need to exist independently of the APIs that you're applying them to. It's no good making policy definition part of the API definition process. Policies need to be defined by different people. For example, your security policies and your protection policies, they need to be authored, defined by a security person, a security team, somebody who has the responsibility ultimately of creating and managing these policies. Then secondarily, the policy should be inherited based on rules, not left up to the developer. In other words, you should not trust or necessarily put it in the hands of your developer to assign a policy to a particular API. The policy should be assigned to an API based on the semantics around the API. So does this API have PCI information or PCI implications? Does this API contain confidential information? Is this API exposed to the public? These are things that drive the inheritance of policy. So policy should not be part of what the API developer does from a day-to-day perspective. It should be inherited despite what the developer does. And what I mean by this is that policies should be separated from the processes and business logic associated with the API definition and the API management. Even with an API management platform like ourselves, a developer can go in, define an API, create all the paths and different HTTP methods and MIME types and things like that. They can go and define their API. But at the end of the day, they may have nothing to do with the assignment of policy. That policy gets assigned because the API is green or blue or exposed to the internet or has PCI constraints around it. Those are the things that actually determine what policies should be applied to an API. Licensing also determines what policies should be applied to an API, and that the definition of licenses is left up to the business administrators. So the business determines how things will be licensed, and quality of service policies get inherited based on licensing, and security and protection policies get inherited based on the semantics and the context of an API and are not included in the API definition. So many people go out there and say, yes, we do policy. And what you end up seeing is some kind of an orchestration mechanism with different steps in it, and policy becomes a part of an orchestration process that needs to be defined by the developer. That is not an appropriate place for policy. That is not enforceable. That is not auditable, and that's not manageable or inheritable. So policy needs to be abstracted from API development, and in general, it should make life easier, and it should help prevent failure. If you leave it up to the developer, it's going to make the developer's life harder. He's going to be sitting there, or she's going to be sitting there, scratching their head, trying to figure out what to do with an OAuth policy. And it should help prevent failure. I mean, things like PCI are so critical here when you think about the cost of a potential failure or the cost of not assigning a policy. And it's just too dangerous to leave that necessarily in the hands of the developer. I keep saying things like necessarily and may because developers could depending on how you configure and the permissions you give them, they could also be responsible for assigning policies or maybe just a subset of policies. So let's talk a little bit about one of the benefits of policies, which is policy-based mediation. So you've defined these policies within the system, and yes, they help you enforce security, and yes, they implement quality of service and enforce service level agreements. But the other things that they can do for you is mediate. And what this ultimately does and what it ultimately gives you as a business is a lower cost and risk. So imagine today you have an internal back-end SOAP-based service which uses WS Security and SAML. Now you want to go and you want to expose an API to the outside world. You want to mediate between that SOAP service you have internally and a JSON REST interface definition that you're exposing to the outside world. And you want to use OAuth with potentially SAML 2 as a single sign-on kind of token. So what we have here is we have two competing or two different security policies. On the outside API interface, you have OAuth with SAML 2. And internally, you have WS Security and SAML. And these security policies are transparent or invisible to the actual developer in the system. So the developer's coming here and he's mapping or she's mapping different RESTful operations and URL parameters to different XML elements and doing REST to SOAP mediation within the product. But the security policies are being inherited and applied and are outside of their control. So it's really, really important that the system can use these policies to automatically convert between one security token type and another security token type. So you should be able to convert the OAuth token that's inbound with an API call and generate the WS security message with a SAML assertion token that is required by the downstream service. So policies need to give you this abstraction, but the price of that abstraction is that they also have to mediate. The benefit of that mediation is that you get lower cost and risk. As a developer, you have to try and figure out how to exchange an OAuth token for a SAML assertion. Good luck to you. That's 2 weeks in a dark place trying to figure out how to do that. And most developers are not going to be able to do that, and it's going to cost you a lot of time and money. Leave those kinds of mediations as well as the inheritance of policy up to the platform that is hosting your APIs. So I've been talking a little bit about platform and making inference to our platform. And we do have a platform, funnily enough, and the platform provides a lot of different services and capabilities. Starting from the bottom, our platform provides lifecycle management, which helps you build the right services and APIs the right way. We also provide service integration, which is all around how do I compose or orchestrate a particular API. One API call in, a little bit of enrichment, some business logic, some branching, call a backend API, or based on some logic, call a different API, transform the message, what have you, and present that reply back. That all falls into the realm of service integration, script execution, and the drag and drop modeling capabilities that we have within the product. Gateway services is separate from that. That is where policy and the non-functional protection, security, quality of service, policy enforcement occurs. I've deliberately separated that from the service integration. Service integration and gateway services should be separate. Processes should be separated from policies. Then above that is all your developer engagement, providing of a developer portal, and on top of that, analytics. How well am I doing? What is the impact of my programs? What's working and what is not? So our API platform provides all of these capabilities: lifecycle management, service integration, gateway services, developer engagement, and analytics. Furthermore, you can get it both as a service or on-premise or in a hybrid deployment model. Depending on your sensitivity to platform as a service or software as a service, you may or may not want to leverage that. You could install it on-premise. Or for some customers, they like the idea of putting the community or the developer portal in the cloud and leveraging that as a service from us, but still terminating all of their API and messaging traffic behind their own firewall using our gateway on-premise. And that's called the hybrid model. So we have our API management solution as a service, on-premise, or hybrid model. So in summary, if you create a solid foundation for API security, it will help your organization to speed up app adoption. It will help you describe your business model appropriately. It will help you to enable and enforce that business model. It will protect your business. It will help you prevent failure and ultimately lower your cost and your risk. And with that, I say thank you and probably open up for questions. But my name is Alistair Parkinson. I'm the CTO of SOA Software. And you can follow either myself or my company on Twitter. Thank you very much. I think we'll unmute the lines and see if anybody has any specific questions. It might take a little while to unmute the lines. Also, if you want to drop off, I thank you again for actually joining. And I think that the recording of this webinar will probably be available either on our website or YouTube channel. Just keep your eyes open for that. You'll probably get an email.
Hi, Alistair.
Yes.
Hi, it's Andre from TELUS, Andre Brickety. I've got a question. I guess I've been hearing, I guess, some feedback. I think you addressed some of these things when we talked at the Cloud Computing Expo. But I've been hearing from developers in general that they want to be enabled and they want to do RESTful services, and they want to empower themselves without any governance process or any intervention from a platform or an architecture governance team. Have you heard anything from other companies, and how would you position it for people like myself to react to statements like that from a developer that doesn't necessarily look at the scalability of a solution or the security?
Yeah, I think it's really important that a developer can go and build an API themselves and feel relatively unconstrained by the platform. I think that practically, though, a company that is exposing an API, especially when it's an extension of their business and a channel, needs to kind of have a measured approach. Yes, a developer can go and build an API, but I don't think a developer can expose an API either to partners or outside of the organization, or potentially even inside the organization, without some kind of control being put into place. Now, though, while that might not be attractive to the developer, I think that it kind of, you need to present it both as a positive and a negative. I think it's the benefits that a developer gets are you don't have to worry about security. I mean, figuring out security is pretty complex, depending on your platform and depending on your security and identity systems in-house. That's quite a burden, and if you can lift that off the developer's shoulders, it will be of great benefit. Secondarily, the visibility that a management solution provides into the API is very, very helpful. So I think you can present some of the positive things to the developer. But now if you think about it from an organization's perspective, the legal agreements, the documentation, the branding, the definition, modeling, all of these things are things that the business needs to take care of when they're exposing an API to the outside world. An API is kind of a product. I mean, you don't go out to the car and release the car without documentation and warranties and legal disclaimers and leasing terms and things like that. But the builder of the car doesn't necessarily care about that or want to be constrained by that. So these are all things that you take and apply to an API as part of kind of a packaging process after the API has been built. So I would say to turn around to the developer and say, look, don't worry about security, don't worry about protection, don't worry about how you're going to present documentation and things like that. Focus on building a good API that is, that observes the principles of Haitius or whatever you embrace as an organization, and try and alleviate those mundane, non-functional things from the developer.
Okay, thanks.
So I don't know if I really answered your question. At the end of the day, I'm just going to have to push back, say, we really do need a platform, a structure around the APIs that we're exposing, because they're a risk to our business, and they're part of our brand and a part of our image.
Agreed. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? A lot of background noise.
Why don't we go ahead and wrap up, and we can publish any other questions and answers, online.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good week.